Leading our session first off this morning is Andy Hait, and he's been with the U.S. Census Bureau for more than 30 years. Andy's an economist, and he advises on economic data products from the Census Bureau's annual, quarterly, and monthly survey programs. He's the lead designer of Census Business Builder, a user-friendly, interactive data tool. Among other things, Andy's going to bring us up to speed on the Census Bureau's new pulse surveys developed after the COVID-19 outbreak to track important measures. Get your questions ready and put them in the Q&A box to see if you can stump this economic expert. Andy's led sessions at our data conference in the past. So Andy, we welcome you back to the Nebraska Data Users Conference.
Great, thank you so much, David. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So while we're going ahead and setting this up, I want to say again a very special thank you to my colleagues and friends in Nebraska. As David mentioned, I've actually been to your conference a couple of times in the past. And I always enjoy coming. I'm very sad that I'm not able to be there in person this year. And I do also want to welcome you to my living room here in Crofton, Maryland. We have been teleworking from the Census Bureau since the beginning of or middle of March. So you're getting a whole perspective on a Census Bureau employee's home. I apologize for not actually having our the background that David had provided. This is one of the challenges of telework. We have to deal with our internet connectivity and our own personal computer challenges. So as David said, I'm going to be providing some information about the business side of the Census Bureau. As you all well know, we are in the midst of conducting the largest undertaking we do at the Census Bureau every 10 years, the decennial census. But if that was the only thing we did, I wouldn't be here today. In fact, we conduct more than 130 different monthly, quarterly, and annual business and demographic surveys every single year. They include the decennial census and the American Community Survey that you all, I'm sure, are very familiar with. The ACS is a fantastic resource in terms of providing demographic, socioeconomic, and housing data about communities in Nebraska that business owners and community planners and other folks can use in their work. But in addition to those demographic, those household programs, we also conduct a number of business surveys. In fact, we conduct 58 business surveys. Those 58 surveys are best represented, I think, in the pyramid that you see here on the right. At the very top of the pyramid is our monthly and quarterly surveys. They are our most timely programs. They provide data every month and every quarter. Some of you may have seen last week's Friday release of the monthly retail trade report that showed how our economy is beginning to recover from COVID-19. They are very timely, but they are not very detailed when it comes to the statistics that are shown, and most importantly, the geography that is shown. In fact, most of those monthly economic indicator surveys are only shown at the national level. There are two, though, that are available below the national level, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. Below that tier of the pyramid is our annual programs. We conduct 20 different business surveys every single year. Some of them are single sector programs, like the annual survey of manufacturers that does publish data for the state of Nebraska on manufacturing. But it also includes some surveys like county business patterns and non-employer statistics that cover all sectors of the US economy. If you learn nothing from me today, it is that county business patterns and non-employer statistics are your best friends. They are the first programs, the first two programs that I always send business data users to, because they cover the two main components that constitute our economy. Employer businesses are covered by county business patterns, and non-employer businesses, or what we typically think of as self-employed people, are covered by the non-employer statistics. Taking those two programs together gives you about 98% of the US economy. At the bottom of the pyramid, though, is our most comprehensive program, the Economic Census. We do this every 5 years on the years ending with 2 and 7. So 2017 is our latest Economic Census. And about the first half or so of my presentation is going to be about the economic census, where we are with the data, what's been released so far, and what's coming later. So let's dive right into the economic census. As I said, this is our most comprehensive, most detailed program. It is the most detailed program in a couple of aspects. Number one is the most detailed program in terms of NAICS, the North American Industry Classification System. We cover data for nearly every 2 through 6 digit NAICS code that is covered by the North American Industry Classification System. There are some exclusions, though. For example, we do not cover farms because USDA does. Actually, I've been to the Census Bureau long enough to know and to remember when we used to actually conduct the Census of Agriculture. In 1997, we turned it over to USDA, and they've been doing it ever since. But in addition to agriculture, farms specifically, there are a few other exclusions. For example, we do not publish data on colleges and universities in the economic census because they are covered by the National Center for Education Statistics. So the link I have provided here does give you a list of the full set of exclusions. And as David, I'm sure, and Melanie said, these materials are going to be shared with you, so you don't have to frantically write that URL down. It is the most detailed program that we do at Census in terms of geography. Data are published all the way down to the place level. A place is the term that we use to refer to both incorporated cities, like the city of Omaha, or unincorporated areas, or what the Census Bureau calls census designated places. The town that I personally live in, Crofton, Maryland, is not an incorporated city. There is no mayor, there is no Crofton government. However, Crofton has boundaries that people recognize, and the Census Bureau publishes data for Crofton, Maryland, so we treat that as what we call a census designated place. You may notice in this list of geographies that the term zip code is missing from that list. Some of you who are familiar with the economic census might remember that we've always historically published zip code level data from the economic census. That has been dropped from the 2017 economic census. We'll learn a little bit more about that later. And before you all freak out that is a really horrible loss, I will remind you that we also publish annually data on zip codes, data by zip codes, in the Zip Code Business Patterns program. So when my colleagues at Census asked me, Andy, we're considering dropping the zip code data from the economic census, would it be a big deal if we did that? I said no. Our users, every user that I send to for who needs zip code data, I send them to ZBP. I don't send them to the economic census because it's an annual series. Why would you look at data every 5 years when you have annual data? The economic census is also our most detailed program in terms of the other dimensions that are published. We have data on things like franchise status. When you're thinking about economic growth in your local communities, often when a business owner is considering opening a particular business, they may want to compare what the characteristics, if you will, of franchise-owned businesses are in comparison to non-franchise businesses. If I were to open a franchise restaurant, am I going to expect to have to pay my employees more or less than a non-franchise? So Census, the economic census does publish data on franchise status in more than 300 industries. I've always been sort of astounded that there's that many industries involved in franchising. Many of you are also interested in small business data, and we actually publish data by business size in 4 ways. We publish it first by establishment size, whether how many employees that establishment has or what the revenue of that establishment is. The second way we publish it is by firm size or company size. And again, companies that have X number of establishments versus companies that have X amount of sales. So if your definition of a small business is a single physical location that has less than 5 employees, we have that data. If your definition of a small business is a company that has less than $1 million in sales, we have that data too in the economic census. It's also our most detailed program in terms of the data variables that are published. Across all NAICS codes, we publish 4 basic statistics: establishments, employment, payroll, and sales. But then for each individual sector, we have a number of additional data variables, in fact, up to 200 data variables that are specific to each sector. So for example, in the manufacturing sector, we publish data on inventories, beginning of the year, ending of the year, finished goods, work in progress, material inventories, capital expenditures, assets, depreciation. It's just an amazing wealth of data. We also publish something called product lines data. These are the individual products and services sold by businesses. So for example, if you were looking at grocery store data and you were looking at the total sales of grocery stores, you might want to know how much of those sales are for produce, how much of those sales are for baked goods, how much of those sales is for toiletries and other kind of personal care products. Those detailed breakouts are what we call product lines. We'll learn a little bit more about those in just a moment. In terms of where the data are released, we are releasing the economic census data primarily on the new data.census.gov platform. I know many of you are bemoaning the loss of American Fact Finder. I have been around for long enough that I remember the birth of American Fact Finder for the 1997 economic census. And I remember what AFF was like in 1997. That's sort of like where we are with data.census.gov today. We are at that kind of similar sort of a phase. But I will tell you from my personal experience that the vision for where data.census.gov can go is so much farther, so much better than where American Fact Finder ever could. The ability simply to combine data across programs that American Fact Finder never allowed you to do, data.census.gov by definition will in the future. So I'm really excited. I don't know that that functionality will be around by the time I retire from the Census Bureau, but I'm really excited, and I would encourage you guys to really check this tool out. We also are going to be adding the data from the economic census to Census Business Builder, the tool that David mentioned that I'm the project lead on. CBB version 3.1, fingers and toes crossed, is going live today. Your timing, David, of your conference is perfect. So we may want to encourage your folks to go out there and check out this brand new release that includes a whole bunch of new data and updates to a lot of the data. Now, because the economic census is such a comprehensive program, it takes us a long time to release everything. We started releasing data from the 2017 economic census in September of last year in what we call the first look. It was a preliminary look at data at the national level. We right now are in the midst of releasing the geographic area statistics, which is the local area data that you all probably care the most about. These data started to release in January, and I know this schedule here says November 2020, but I'm very pleased to say that we actually released the very, very last 3 sectors of data, mining, construction, and manufacturing, this morning at 7:30 this morning. So the geographic area statistics now are complete. So if you want to go in and actually pull data for Nebraska from data.census.gov from the economic census, you'll now get everything. You won't be missing mining, construction, and manufacturing the way it's been for the last couple of weeks. After that, we'll be releasing our product data, the size data, and miscellaneous subjects, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. To help users understand about this flow release of those local area data, we created a resource page. I've provided the link here on the site. That resource page provides a list of what's been released so far, what's coming, and what's coming in the next 30 days. As I just said, we are now complete. So the map that you're seeing on the right-hand side, this hex map that shows what sectors and what states have been released so far, that looks pretty full right now. If you were to look at it this morning, or maybe tomorrow morning, as of today, the entire map is complete, and those state hexes are now completely filled with a peach fill. So at a glance, users can see what sectors have been released so far for Nebraska. As I just said, they've all been released. Now, this visualization is really nice in a couple of respects. Not only did it provide information on what's been released and what states haven't yet been released, but if you notice, there's also a sector drop-down menu here. So let's say I was interested in the healthcare sector in Nebraska. I could choose healthcare from that menu. The map would then refresh and it would show me all the states that we have released healthcare data for. If I then clicked on the hex for Nebraska, I would then get a little pop-up box that includes a link into data.census.gov, a shortcut. If I were to click on that shortcut, it would then bring me right into data.census.gov, already pre-filtered for Nebraska for healthcare. So this tool is a nice way to get around, if you will, the menus in data.census.gov and get right to the data. Now, as you can imagine, when you click on that link, it's going to bring you to state level data for healthcare in this example, but you can actually go in and change the geography to a particular county or metro or city that you might be interested in. So I'm very happy we did this. It made it very easy, or much easier, for people to get to our data. Now, as I mentioned, there's a number of changes that have been applied to the 2017 Economic Census. One of the major soapbox things I'm going to talk about today, and I talk about all the time, is that geography is not static. The boundaries of states haven't changed in a long time. We haven't added any states in quite a while, but the boundaries of counties, places, and metropolitan areas do. So anytime you are comparing data over time, and I'm going to harp on this a little bit, even when you're comparing data other than Census Bureau data, you need to be aware of whether or not the boundaries of that thing that you are comparing are in fact comparable. The town that I live in, for example, annexed some neighboring land a couple of years ago. If I were to compare the economic data for the town of Crofton, Maryland today to the economic data for the town of Crofton, Maryland 10 years ago, I would be comparing a geography whose boundary today is larger. It now includes land that didn't include before. That land includes about 60 businesses that were in there. So if I were to compare that data and not be aware of that geography change, it would make me think that Crofton's grown a lot, when in fact some of that growth is due to that boundary change. So boundaries change constantly, and we have a lot of training materials available from the Economic Census to help you understand those changes. We'll talk about that in just a second. ENAIC's classification system also changes, and there's a couple of those. We'll talk about that in a second. Those product lines data that I mentioned are now going to be published under this brand new classification system called NAPS, the North American Product Classification System, and there's definitely some major changes there. This last change that I want to highlight is that we at the Census Bureau often use data from administrative sources as a supplement to the data that we collect from businesses themselves. So for example, if I sent a form to David for his business, let's just pretend he had a business, and he was a good citizen and he completed his economic census form for his business, life would be happy for us. But if David chose to not fill out his economic census form, of course he would never do that, but if he were to do that, and we were then to want to aggregate data for the county and the type of business that David owns, we'd be missing his data. So what we do is we pull in data from the administrative sources. Those include the IRS and Social Security Administration. Well, the IRS has gotten a little cranky. I probably shouldn't say that, but I'm going to say it. With how they ask us to protect privacy with their data. So when we commingle Census Bureau business and demographic data, or Census Bureau business data, with IRS business data, they have now asked us to apply these new disclosure rules. They're part of the IRS Pub 1075 rule. The impact to Nebraska is going to be that you are going to see less data in 2017 than what you saw before. And that's sort of the bummer portion of my presentation. I feel as an economist, I have a duty and responsibility to let you know about that. Those suppressions are more prevalent in the smaller counties and smaller industries in Nebraska than they are in larger counties and larger industries in Nebraska. And you'll actually see that in just a moment when we get into the data. So I mentioned about geography change. And this slide provides just a little tiny bit of information about the changes that have occurred in Nebraska between 2012 and 2017. There were no metro area changes, so you can easily compare data for the metropolitan areas in Nebraska from 2017 to 2012 and know you're making an apples and apples comparison. However, 70 of the economic places we published data for had some type of change. 34 of them gained area, 31 of them lost area. None of them had a name change. That's an important thing sometimes, because if you're searching for data for a particular town and the name of that town has changed, you wouldn't find it in the new system. There are 4 brand new places. They're actually shown on the right-hand side of the slide. These are places that used to have fewer than 2,500 population, or that had fewer than 2,500 population in 2012, and now have grown where they're now more than 2,500 population. So for the first time, these 4 cities, Dakota City, Valley, Kimball, and Madison, all now are valid for inclusion, separate inclusion in the economic census. And fortunately, we didn't drop any places. There were no towns in Nebraska that had more than 2,500 population in 2012 that now have fewer than 2,500 population in 2017. Now, this was a total tease. You're all wondering, well, what are those areas that had gain? In the upper right-hand corner is a link to our geographies page on the Economic Census website, where you can go in and actually see what are all those cities and towns that had changes. If a simple chart, an Excel file display is not enough for you, in the bottom of the slide, we have a link to a web application called Tiger Web Econ. And this is a really nice tool because it allows you to see, literally visually see on a map, those boundary changes. So I could see what are those 34 places in Nebraska that had area gain. And I then, as the data user, could make the decision, yeah, I know it gained area, but that gain is so small, I don't care. It's close enough for government work. Or I could look at that and say, yikes, that gain was a huge gain. It really is going to impact the data comparability, and I need to account for that in my analysis. So some great resources. As I mentioned, NAICS changes every 5 years. These next 2 slides provide a very, very simple summary of what those major changes are. There are some changes where pieces of activity got pulled out of one code and put into another. So you can see in the mining sector, these peach-related ones are part of that. For the retail trade sector, you can see that discount department stores that sold an insignificant amount of perishable groceries are still considered grocery department stores, but those clubs, those discount department stores that sold a significant amount of perishable grocery sales have actually been reclassified and are now considered warehouse clubs and supercenters. So again, this affects the comparability of the data over time. The green highlighted ones are combinations, cases where we used to publish breakouts of industries that now have been consolidated into a single code. On the right-hand side, for example, is you can see the breakout that we used to have for household appliances, cooking, refrigeration, laundry, and other. We used to have 4 separate NAICS codes for those 4 activities. If any of you have ever gone shopping recently at a home center to look at an appliance and looked at the label to see where that appliance was made, you're not going to find made in the USA very often. And because of that, our ability to publish data for each of those 4 categories was really hard. In fact, we actually had to suppress a lot of the data for those detailed industries because there's so few refrigerator manufacturers in the US anymore. So they've now all been consolidated. This second slide provides the information on the 3 other sectors that have had changes. The information sector, you can see those changes. The real estate sector on the right-hand side, everything that's in blue are one-to-one changes, where all we changed was the code. So if I cared about videotape of disc rental, I don't know why I would, but if I did care about videotape and disc rental, if there are any of those out anymore, you can see the NAICS code in 2012 is now changed in 2017. The data are totally comparable, it's just a different code. The professional, scientific, and technical services sector is the only sector that has seen a brand new code. So we are now, for the first time ever, publishing data on R&D in nanotechnology. That industry has matured enough, has grown enough in the United States in terms of the numbers of players that we can now publish detailed data on nanotechnology. Kind of cool. As I mentioned, these data can be accessed in a number of different places. These different tools that are available, data.census.gov is the primary place, but we've just added the data to Census Business Builder. As we were working on these releases, we realized that letting people know what's coming out via social media would be kind of cool. So we decided to do these little fun facts. This is one of the fun facts that we created for Nebraska that highlights the number of businesses in the real estate and rental and leasing sector and what their revenues were in 2017. I've provided a link to that visualizations page and even an America Count story that I wrote about how the economy in the US is changing. So I would encourage you all to kind of check these out. I would love to take credit for being so creative and choosing the 50 state quarters as the theme for these fun facts. I did not. One of my colleagues in our communications directorate was the one who actually came up with that idea, and I love them. I'm a bit of a coin nut. I have the full collection of all of them, so it was nice to choose that. Now, in the next couple of slides, I am very, very, very quickly going to zoom through some findings that you would find if you looked at data from the Economic Census for Nebraska. I am not going to spend a lot of time on here. I want to make sure I leave time for questions and also to talk about something after the Economic Census. So I would encourage you all to check these out. And I will also admit that these slides were not updated this morning. So that means the mining, construction, and manufacturing data that you can see is missing from the bar chart on the left is missing because it wasn't available when I pulled the data for this, but it is published now. So I would encourage you guys to explore this. As you can see on the left-hand side, wholesale trade is by far the largest sector in Nebraska. And when I then look at the change in the economic data going from 2012 to 2017, wholesale trade also saw the largest increase, increasing by about $4.6 billion between 2012 and 2017. Second ranked is the healthcare and social assistance sector, and then you can see the other two sectors that are behind there. This is a pretty typical thing that we see across most states. Wholesale is gigantic, wholesale grows a lot. Wholesale is very subject to price change, and we'll actually see that in just a moment. So this is pretty representative of the rest of the country. When I dove into the wholesale sector a little bit more detail to see, well, what are the particular industry groups, the 4-digit NAICS codes that are dominant in Nebraska, you can clearly see that there are two sectors, two industry groups that are clearly dominant. Grocery and related product merchant wholesalers is the first pair of codes, and the second pair is farm product raw material merchant wholesalers. They are both huge, but they did change quite a bit differently between 2012 and 2017. Grocery and related product merchant wholesalers saw a big increase from about 12.6 billion to about 17.3 billion, while farm product raw material wholesalers declined from 2012 to 2017. I don't know why I forgot to put the label on that 2012 bar. As I said, our data are not adjusted for inflation, so price change of farm products could be a big indication, could be a big reason why these data have gone down. Now, within that grocery wholesaler industry, I was really sort of curious, well, what counties really dominate? And this is where the bummer part of this presentation comes back again. These two counties, Lancaster County and Hall County, are two of the biggest counties that we actually publish data for grocery wholesalers. You can see that Lancaster County had a pretty substantial increase from 664 million to 862 million, so about $200 million increase. But again, pretty limited in terms of the geography data that's available. If you were to compare this change for these two counties to the data that is shown for the entire industry or the entire sector, you'd see that there's a lot of counties that we didn't publish data for because of suppression, because of these privacy rules that we now have to abide by. Now, another sector that did pretty well was transportation. And again, I was kind of curious to see how were the individual subsectors, the 3-digit NAICS codes within transportation, how did they compare from 2012 to 2017? And you can again clearly see that truck transportation in Nebraska substantially dominates the transportation and warehousing sector, and had obviously the largest increase in that. We're back to this spectacle show. I'm going the wrong way, sorry. Looking at county level data to see where did that big increase in truck transportation by the state level, where did it show up? And you can see again, Douglas County clearly leads the other counties. Again, we did see more counties displayed, but again, there's quite a few counties where we had suppressions of the data. Now, another sector that had increased quite a bit in Nebraska between 2012 and 2017 was the administrative and support and waste management and remediation services. Boy, that's a mouthful. And within that sector, the specific 4-digit industry group that increased the most was employment services. Now, I want to remind folks that what we call employment services not only includes temp agencies, but it also includes what we call employee leasing companies. So businesses that lease employees to other businesses. It's kind of like a temp, but the arrangement between the agency that quote unquote owns that employee and the place where they work is a very different relationship for these PEOs, these professional employer organizations, versus a temp agency. And again, this particular industry group has done very well in Nebraska. It really sort of surprised me to see that this particular sector has grown so much. Florida is another state that has seen a huge increase in employment services. So I was kind of curious to see where is that happening. And once again, Douglas County floated to the top of the list. You must have some very large PEOs or employee temp companies in Douglas County where you see that big change. Healthcare is sort of universal across the United States in terms of its growth. I was curious to see within the healthcare sector which of the particular subsectors, the 3-digit NAICS codes, grew the most. And you can see that hospitals certainly saw the largest increase and are the largest subsector within healthcare, followed by ambulatory healthcare services, which includes doctors' offices. Again, not much of a surprise in comparison to other states. But again, when I then went in and drilled down into ambulatory healthcare services to see how is that growth distributed across all of your counties, you again can see that Douglas and Lancaster County really dominate. Now, this is an important point I want to make about distribution of healthcare businesses by county. I talked to a lot of data users who utilize our data to help make the case that rural communities really need healthcare services, and that making someone drive or fly 100 miles to get to a hospital when you're in a rural area of Nebraska is really a bummer. The economic census data can help tell that story, but what I will also remind you all of is because the economic census only covers employer businesses, that means that there could be a lot of self-employed people, what we call non-employers, that need to be added to these numbers. So what I always tell people is add the non-employer statistics data to the economic census data to give you a total picture of the economy, and in this case, the healthcare economy in your state. Now, this is the last slide I want to talk about. We're going to take a quick break, but after we've now completed these local area data, we will start releasing those product data files, the NAPS codes. Those will start coming out in November of this year. I would very much encourage you all to check out the link in the bottom right-hand corner, which is the Understanding NAPS page, so you can kind of get a preview of what these product data are going to look like in 2017 versus what they look like in 2012. In November, we will also start releasing those establishment and firm size reports. And the one thing that I'm really happy to tell you all about is for those of you who have used these employment size or sales size tables in the past and were frustrated that if you cared about small business across all 18 of the sectors that we publish in the Economic Census, and you had to go to 18 separate files to get that employment size data, you don't have to do that anymore. We've consolidated those size tables into 7 consolidated tables. So it'll be much, much easier for you to compare small business data across sectors. You can see how prevalent small businesses are in some sectors and not so much in others. And then finally, at the end of this entire economic census, we then release the miscellaneous subject tables. These are sort of an interesting eclectic mix of some oddball tables that get released at the end. So with that, David, let's take a pause and let's see if anybody has any questions before I get into the last part of the presentation.
That's right, Andy. Let's talk a bit about the economic census. You know, it faced some budget cuts and some challenges as it was going, and there's been some shift to online reporting and other differences. So can you talk about that a little bit for how that might have impacted things,
Sure.
as well as how you view the economic census as being valuable, especially to everyday data users?
Right. So you're absolutely right, David. When we got ready to mail the 2017 economic census forms, which would have been mailed at the beginning of 2018, we had some fairly substantial budget cuts at the Census Bureau that delayed mailing by about 6 months. Then, right when we finally got our act together and started collecting data, we had a little thing called a government shutdown. And we all got sent home and no work happened for an extended period of time. The end result of those 2 unfortunate circumstances resulted in our data being released about 9 months later than what they would have been released in the past, what they were released in the 2012 economic census. So yeah, it is a bummer. I'm sitting here talking to you all in August of 2020 about 2017 economic census local area data finally just being finished, but it is the reality of what we have to deal with. I know that there are substantial work being done to try to address this in the future. Shifting to electronic response was a blessing and a curse. We definitely found that using 100% electronic response for the 2017 economic census, no paper form, was absolutely a godsend for some industries and for some geographies, and it was a pain in the behind for others. So I suspect for the 2022 economic census, we may reinstate paper forms for certain geographies and certain types of businesses because some of those businesses may have really struggled filling out their economic census form online. Overall, we did see a decline in response rate, but it is still something that we are pretty happy with. We were at 82% for the 2012 economic census. We're at 78% for the 2017 economic census. So that does mean that we are having to impute data based upon administrative records for a pretty substantial chunk of the businesses, nearly 30% of the businesses, 22% of the businesses. But I think the quality of the data, as much as it pains us to not get 100% response rate, the quality of the data is still very, very good. And that speaks as much to the work that our analysts do when they receive the data from the businesses. We do not let businesses choose their own NAICS code, and we do not let businesses just give us their data without us looking at it first. That is not the same as a lot of other data providers that basically trust self-response and do essentially no edits to the data. If we were looking at data, let's say for an industry where the average payroll per employee was $30,000, and David, you filled out your census form and you reported your employment in payroll and the ratio ended up being $300,000, I would probably call you. And I would say, either you added an extra 0 to your payroll data, and it really is more like $30,000 a person, or I would ask you if you're hiring. So we do a lot of analysis of the data. The value of the economic census is really there in a couple of ways. It's valuable as a historical resource. It allows us to look at what our economy was before, how it's changing, and it serves as the basis of those annual, monthly, and quarterly surveys that then provide data after the economic census. It's also really valuable because of the detail that is shown. None of our other business surveys, the annuals or the quarterlies or monthlies, publish the level of geographic or industry detail that you can get in the economic census. So again, helping to understand the economy in Nebraska, you need to have that more detailed data to be able to make decisions. The more current data is great. I love sending people to the more current annual, quarterly, and monthly data, but it still is not nearly as comprehensive as the econ census is. So yeah, great question.
Okay, and then another question I'll pose to you now, you might choose to answer after your next section of information, but I think the audience would like to hear your thoughts on this. Mm-hmm. It says, there have been statements how mask mandates hurt businesses. Is there any data which shows if this is true or not?
So I will defer answering it partially based upon what the next couple of slides are. We're going to be talking about some of the new COVID data that we actually have. But I will say that we did not collect any data in either the household pulse or the small business pulse survey that even got close to asking a question about mask mandates. So you know, if you look at the data and you see a big decline in the revenue for restaurants because of COVID, knowing why that revenue declined, we cannot specifically identify that it's because of mask mandates, or for that matter, any particular reason. So yeah, I would love to be able to say yes or no, but we just don't have the statistics to do it. So.
Okay, great. Why don't you go ahead and continue on?
Sure. Okay. So. In my last 15 minutes, we're going to zoom through some of the newer programs we have at the Census Bureau that you might be interested in. Some of you in Nebraska are familiar with a survey called the Survey of Business Owners, or SBO. SBO was done every 5 years, on the same years as we do the economic census, and it published comprehensive data on business ownership by race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status. Fabulous program. Let you look at information on Native American-owned businesses in Nebraska, for example, or women-owned businesses, or veteran-owned businesses in Nebraska. Excuse me. SBO covered both employer businesses, businesses with paid employees, and businesses without paid employees, non-employers. And it was a huge survey. It was a lot of work for us to do, and it was a very expensive program. So we realized that having data every 5 years wasn't enough, so we created a temporary survey called the ASC, the Annual Survey of Entrepreneurs. Started being released in 2013 after the 2012 SBO, and was released for a couple of years as just sort of a placeholder. It provided pretty limited detail, and it did not cover non-employers. Well, we just released on May 19th the replacement for both of these. It's called the ABS, the Annual Business Survey. It does restore some of the geographic and industry detail that was available in SBO that was not shown in ASC. So you do have national and state level data at the full NAICS breakout. At the county, metro, and place level, it's only 2-digit sectors, but at least you've got some local area data by race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status. The big bummer is that it still does not include non-employers, but I have it on good authority that they are actually working on an expansion to ABS that will, fingers and toes crossed, add back the non-employer data. I think they fully recognize how important self-employment is when you think about minority business ownership, women business ownership. There are far more Hispanic-owned non-employer businesses than there are employer businesses. So it's a great survey. Check it out. When we were coming into the COVID-19 pandemic, we recognized that not only were existing businesses going to be impacted, but new businesses might be impacted. We have had for a number of years a program called BFS, the Business Formation Statistics. It's an annual program that provides information on business startups, applications, formations. We took that survey and are now updating it weekly. So if you look at how the data over time have compared to what's happened since COVID-19, by state, you will actually see how business startups were impacted in Nebraska. And it's a pretty interesting program. It provides some great breakout on the different types of business applications that there exist, business applications from corporations or high propensity business applications that have planned wages. These are all sort of terms when you go to apply for your employer identification number that you need to tell the IRS kind of what am I trying to open. And it's a great program. The next one I want to quickly talk about is the Small Business Pulse Survey. This survey was released on May 14th and helps us understand how small businesses have been being impacted by COVID-19. The data, I see a mistake here on the slide. I copy and paste is a problem. The data are not shown by race, ethnicity, and gender. The data are shown by NAICS sector, as you can see on the right-hand side, 2-digit NAICS sectors, and they are shown at the national, state, and region levels. So we can go in and look at businesses in Nebraska, small businesses in Nebraska, to look at what their overall impact was and specific questions on certain characteristics of those businesses. So for example, have businesses missed loan payments due to COVID-19? Have they seen changes to their cash flow due to COVID-19? There's a variety of statistics. I would really encourage you all to check these out. The NAICS breakout is pretty interesting too. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that NAICS 72, which is the second to last bar on the right. I know it's really hard to read that. That's a combination in food services. You can see that sector, no surprise, was really hammered by this COVID-19 pandemic. I thought it was interesting to see how little impact there was not only on utilities, which is NAICS 22. It's probably a good thing in the heat of the summertime that our utility companies are still producing electricity and weren't affected by COVID-19. But I was interested to see how small the impact was for NAICS 52, which is finance and insurance. So our banking systems and our insurance companies have basically continued operating even during the COVID-19 pandemic. So they were not as affected. These data are pretty interesting. The slide here is a little old. This is from week 3. We just released the week 9 data. There will be about a 1-month gap between week 9 and when we restart the Small Business Pulse Survey in phase 2. Phase 2 will carry forward some of the survey questions we asked in phase 1, and will also add some new questions that are there to kind of understand not only how businesses were initially impacted, but how they're beginning to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. I've provided the link to our experimental data products page where the Small Business Pulse Survey lives, and I would encourage you guys really to check that out. Because we knew that people were going to struggle a little getting to some of these data, we created a special COVID-19 data hub that assembles together selected risk factor variables from the American Community Survey and from some of our economic programs into a very useful, intuitive kind of dashboard and other applications. So on the left-hand side, you're seeing the very top of the COVID-19 hub. If we have a moment, I'm running short on time. I may be able to show you guys a quick demo of the impact planning report and the whole COVID hub. One point I want to make about this is not only can you view these data online on the screen, you can manipulate these maps, but all of the information that's available in the hub is available for download, not only in simple CSV and Excel file formats, but for those of you who are listening in today that are GIS professionals or who have Geographic Information System staff that work in your offices, they can actually bring down all this data already formatted for them as shapefiles and as reference layers data layers, they can bring it right into ArcGIS and build their own maps. So we've done a lot of work. I'm actually one of 4 people that are on the census side that worked with Esri to actually build this entire COVID-19 hub. And we've gotten really good reviews for it. The link to the hub is in the upper right-hand corner. And I'll actually show you that in just a second if I have a moment. And then we also have written a number of America Count stories and other materials on this hub and on COVID-19. The link to those topical pages is in the bottom left-hand corner. So to summarize, we have a ton of data available from the Economic Census. The data are still coming out. Please, please, please make sure when you are comparing data from any source, again, I'm going to harp on this, I can be a data nerd pain in the behind. Whenever you're comparing data over time, make sure the thing you're comparing is comparable. So use those geographic resources. And again, the COVID Hub is a great resource. Let me quickly jump out of here, David, just so you can see the COVID Hub. So this is our main Census Bureau homepage. To get to the COVID resource page and the COVID Hub, we click on this hideous icon of the COVID coronavirus itself. This will bring you to the COVID-19 resource page, where you can get access to some of those surveys we talked about, the business formation statistics, that small business pulse survey. There's also a demographic version of the small business pulse survey called the household pulse survey that looks at how households are being impacted by COVID-19. Really great program. One little shout out I will for my census colleagues. In my 33 years at the Census Bureau, I have never seen us stand up 2 surveys, or in this case 3 surveys, as quickly as these ones came up. From the initial inception to data release was 64 days. That's like a blink of an eye in the Census Bureau's way of thinking about things. So I'm very proud of my census colleagues and our folks at OMB who allowed us to get approval to do this. Let me scroll back up. If I click on this hub link, it's actually going to bring me to the COVID-19 hub that we were just looking at. We have some stats at the very top. Here's that impact planning report. I'm sure you all don't care about New York as a state. So let's scroll down and let's choose Nebraska. From the state, I can now go ahead and choose Nebraska, and the impact report refreshes to show demographic and business data on 2 pages, fully interactive. You can click on these, you can download the data, and I can also go in and actually choose a particular county. Let's just choose Brown County, and we'll be looking at the same type of data specifically for Brown County. So here's the planning report. Below there is a brand new section that we just added 2 weeks ago, the business formation statistics. It has its own dashboard now. These are the startups, the data on business startups. Below there are then some new surveys, those additional surveys that are also available: Household Pulse, the Small Business Pulse, and the Community Resilience Estimates. Small Business Pulse is the next one that we are actually adding to this dashboard. So just like this, you will have an entire dashboard just for the Small Business Pulse survey. Right now, if I were to click on this, it just jumps you out to another census program page. Below there are those maps that you all were seeing. There's actually 8 maps in the series. This is the map for population households less than $75,000. As I zoom in, I can actually be able to, let's see, here's Nebraska. I can now see the data at the county level. So it allows me to go in and zoom into that. And some of the maps are even let you zoom in even further. To allow you all to get access to the raw data, there is access to the information here under this highlighted datasets page. This is where your GIS professionals will go to download those reference layers, those data layers that are already been pre-digested for you in ArcGIS. And for those of you who are not GIS nerds and want the data in the simple Excel file format, you can go to these different characteristics and actually go in and actually download the data in an Excel file or as a feature layer. So I can go in and access these as well. So I'm pretty happy with all the work that we put into building this COVID-19 hub. At the very bottom of the page are links to a few of our other tools on census.gov. the data.census.gov application, my favorite Census Business Builder, and the On the Map for Emergency Management tool. And we've even added a link out to the CDC website and the Health and Human Services GeoHealth portal. So David, that is my story for today. Let me get back.
While you're there, Andy, question came in. Any way to use the economic surveys to look at the impact of COVID-19 on child care providers or demographics of owners of child care providers?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a great question. I should not have jumped back out of here. Let me see me get back over to my page. When we were choosing what types of businesses we wanted to include in this platform, we recognized that not only would businesses like restaurants and stuff be impacted, but so would other types of businesses. So if I went in here and looked at employer businesses, we've got sort of the top 20, if you will, industries that have been impacted by COVID-19. Childcare services we specifically added. So this is going to give you information on the number of childcare services, their employment, their payroll in those different geographies that could have been impacted. And when you then look at the more detailed data in the Small Business Pulse survey, that's where you can then start to see the data on what the actual impact was in that sector. I will remind you all that the level of industry detail we have in Small Business Pulse is not as detailed as we have in these other sort of reference resources like county business patterns and non-employer statistics. But yes, the information is available. That actually, David, is one of the questions that they are considering adding on phase 2 of the Small Business Pulse surveys to provide additional industry detail for industries that we know are really having a tough day.
And some of that information was new from the Pulse survey, and some of it was like a repackaging of ACS or other information. Could you just go over that real quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. So Small Business Pulse, brand new survey, fresh collection. We actually mail out forms to about 100,000 small businesses across the US, tabulate the data from those surveys. This was a completely online survey via email, which again, another first for the Census Bureau. We did the entire survey via email. The data that's shown up over here for these employer businesses, these child daycare centers, these data over here are from county business patterns and from non-employer statistics. So again, sort of those two historical data resources. Here is child daycare services. You can see there's a lot of non-employer self-employed people that provide child daycare services, way more, like 10 times more than there are employers. So again, we're trying to repackage the existing annual data we have to sort of to set the stage for how many businesses could have been impacted or might have been impacted, and then provide the Pulse data that then zooms in and says, these are the ones that were, this is what their impact was, this is how many of them that saw a decline in their cash flow due to COVID-19, et cetera.
Okay, I'll ask you one more question before we close, because you're kind of an expert, and I think this is a good question for you. You talked about the suppression of data for smaller counties in the economic census. Yep. So the question came in, you know, Nebraska has a lot of like health districts or economic development districts that are multiple counties. So does Census have a way or assistance to look at things at a district level, multiple counties, where you wouldn't have to have that level of suppression?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is yes and no. Of course, that's a very government short answer. We do not aggregate the county level data to those districts as sort of a predefined level of aggregation. But if the person who asked that question really wanted to research this and was interested in accessing the micro level data in the form of one of our research data centers, which are across the whole country. Many of the universities in Nebraska are a research data center. They could actually do that custom tabulation themselves and aggregate that data where, let's say a district is made up of 5 counties. If 2 of those counties were suppressed, they would not be able to see the data for that at the county level. But maybe when they aggregated it up to the district level, those 2 counties combined with the other 3 now is publishable. So I have been encouraging people to become more familiar, more aware of the Research Data Center network that the Census Bureau runs across the country, because it may be a resource that you can turn to do these kinds of custom tabulations rather than having us do the tabulation for you.
Okay, great. We'll keep that in mind. I think there is one of those research centers at Nebraska Lincoln.
Yep.
We can work together on that. So we're going to wrap up. Thanks so much, Andy, for all your assistance and knowledge sharing today. This has been some great information to get out to our folks. It's very timely. Now is the time for economic census data use and some of these COVID surveys.